us for doing it than it was. And I do appreciate you doing that. The Praxis again is presenting Thursday, March 4th at 7 o'clock in lane 124 right next to us. Dr. Rasmussen from Indiana University is going to be speaking basically on game theory, bargaining, bluffing, and breakdown, negotiation with game theory's random strategies. So again, you might want to put that on the calendar and have the exams back. Okay, Emma, ready for smart out back. Vera, Sarah Strauss. We can just hand this back that direction. Thomas Rogers. Jillian. Tyler. Lindsay. Caroline. Caroline Lively. Michael Hagestad. Joseph Wagner. Anthony Lamacchia. Kaylin Walker. You said it back up. Andrew Giovannotti.
Sorry.
Okay, Lucas Keller. Michaela. Send that back to Michaela. Yeah, you're gonna. We have to give you $1 because we keep. Joe Bentley. Jack Smith. Okay, Parker.
Parker's not neighborhood, I can get it to him.
Okay. Just remember, when Parker can't find his exam, give it to him. Okay. Sam. Sarah Wagoner. Jaden Buzzard. Kaisa. Okay, Mercedes. Tom Bircher. Drew Gutzel. Aiden Wheeler. Gave away free.
Not that great.
Cost me like probably $2.
Oh.
Okay, Teresa Enns. Okay, Andrew Nell. And Rachel. Okay, everybody got theirs?
I was a minute late. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, Vera? Yeah. And that's what I thought. So call you first. There you go. All right. The median grade was a 44. Don't anybody tell Dr. Arnn, because as you know, that's, I said between 80 and 90 is a B, so that's sort of on the high end of the B range. So he doesn't usually like to have, if you ever listen to him talk, right, he doesn't like to have everybody A's and B's, right? It's really hard to get still. So people did, in general, did pretty well on the exam. So let's go ahead and go over the exam. Number one, according to the Coase theorem, right? And that is what? A is correct, right? Transactions costs are sufficiently low. Solution of externality problem is to assign property rights to one of the parties, okay? Again, that was an important point, that if transaction costs are low and I'm the government, I don't have to know who values it more, who values the property right more. I can assign it to either party. Now that will affect the distribution of income, right? You'd much rather have the right than you have to buy it from the other party. But from an efficiency standpoint, it doesn't matter. B, the optimal amount of public good is where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal benefit the last person received the good. It's not in the Coase, right? I just sort of made that up. And a positive externality requires a subsidy equal to the marginal social benefit. That's not what he's talking about, right? He's talking about that people are going to bargain in the thing, and I don't need to know what the Pavlovian subsidy would be. And it is, he didn't say anything about people revealing their preference for a public good. It had to do with externalities, right? So the correct answer there was A. So any questions on that one? All right. Number two, what is the purpose of the Clark tax? C is the correct answer, right? The idea of the Clark tax was to get you to reveal your preference for the public good. That is, you paid a tax equal to the difference between the marginal social benefit to everybody and the marginal social cost minus you, right? So the idea is that that wouldn't be very much to start with, and because you're adding, your demand curve is above the, is downward sloping and is greater than zero. Remember the idea was that, your demand curve would look like that, and everybody else's demand curves would look like that. And what would happen is that your Clark tax would be such that your marginal, the added cost to everybody else, in a sense, from their marginals, their benefit and cost, that added cost is what you're going to pay, and you'll keep going until you get to where your marginal benefit is just equal to your Clark tax, and that's the difference between what everybody else is. So the idea is that if you knew, again, you have to sort of know what the marginal social benefit to everybody is, right? Can you possibly, implement this? But the purpose of this is to not to give you how you'd actually implement it, but to give you, again, an idea of where you might want to be headed with these sorts of things. So, again, the purpose of the Clark tax was to get people to reveal their preference for a public good. And then the others, I made up. So, any questions on C? And again, I put the Clark tax papers in your Wolfram folder in Econ 402. So if you wanted to do something with your paper on it, or if you just really wanted to know more about it, that's where you take a look at it. Which of the following is true about Buchanan's theory of clubs, right? That was all those things. That is, it deals with goods for which there is congestion, right? And then what do? Given the size of the facility, right, I will keep adding people as long as their congestion costs, that is the reduction in the marginal benefit or the benefit per person, as long as that's less than the reduction in the cost per person, I keep letting you in, right? And just sort of logic. And then with the the next part is, given the number of people, you'll keep increasing the size of the facility. When you increase the size of the facility, the benefit per person is going up, but the cost per person is going up. So I'll keep increasing the size of the facility as long as our benefit per person is going up faster than the cost per person is going up. And so you've got two equations and two unknowns, and we can solve for both Q and N. And so the correct answer there was all the above. Any any questions on that one, right? So remember to draw the pictures of convexity. Okay. Number 4, okay, that was just right at the very beginning. You know, I gave you some data, and I said you ought to be able to recognize something when it's close. There's marker. Oh, you took his exam. Let me forget. All right. So all those things are correct, right? I mean, again, the federal government outlays in 2020 are about the same as the outlays in 87 as a percentage of GDP. Why did I pick 87? Because that was the first $1 trillion budget, right? So the point is that outlays per capita, or excuse me, outlays per unit of GDP tend to be about the same if you look around. Now, obviously we have some interesting times going on, and you know, it looks like the Biden $1.9 trillion reconciliation bill is going to go through, and so our expenditure, federal government expenditures per unit of GDP is probably going to be much higher than the norm. But you know, historically, it has not changed a whole lot in terms of percentage of GDP. The second important point that we made was that federal government mandatory spending is a very large percentage of the budget, and it has been increasing over time. So we made the point that if you were to eliminate all the 12 appropriations bills, just didn't pass them at all the discretionary spending, and funded the interest on the national debt, and you funded defense, you'd still run a deficit. So if you want to deal with the deficit, then you're really going to have to talk about, okay, what are we going to do about Medicare? What are we going to do about Social Security? We're going to raise the payroll tax. None of those things are very popular, right? You didn't hear anybody running for president saying, hey, I'm out here to raise the payroll tax, right? I'm here to reduce Social Security spending. I'm here to reduce Medicare, right? We're going to have Medicare for all, right? So that tells you it's going to be very difficult to deal with the deficit spending. And then again, since 1968, the payroll tax has increased substantially relative to the individual income tax, and of course, that's related to the fact that we started Social Security and Medicare in 1965, and that has been the ballooning part of the federal budget. So again, all those things we talked about at the very first part of class, and I gave you a bunch of sites where you could look at the data. Again, the budget report of the president and the like. There's a number of sites that I gave you on that. All right, which you'll find is true of the Lindahl equilibrium, right? And so Lindahl, again, was writing in 1919, and what's he talking about? He's talking about looking where the sum of the marginal benefits is equal to the marginal cost, right? Which is what Samuelson is going to talk about much later as the Samuelson condition. But the idea of, Lindahl's point was that everybody is going to pay the amount for the public good that's equal to the marginal benefit at the point where the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost. And that they would be happy with that. I mean, his idea was the unanimity, right? Because I'm going to be happy at that point. If we were to expand it, my marginal benefit would be less than my tax price. If I were to the left of that, if I had less output, then my marginal benefit would be bigger than my tax price, and so I'd want to move to there. So if you look at Lindahl equilibrium, everybody's going to be happy with that. And of course, that leads to the deal, well, okay, if I know that my marginal, if I tell you what my marginal benefits are, you're going to assign me this tax price, why don't I just say, hey, I got zero marginal benefit, right? Because if it's a pure public good, I'm going to get it anyway. And so that's why the Clark tax idea was. Is there some way we could think of that we could get people to reveal their preference? So again, the Lindahl equilibrium is this is a point that if we could conceptualize it, then we can see this is where the optimal amount would be. And what's the deal? The deal is that for a government good, everybody gets the same amount. So what do you got to do? Everybody's got to pay a different price to get you to where it is. On a private good, what happens? Everybody pays the same price, but you can vary the Q, and that's why the Lindahl is a conceptual way of looking at how can we get it so that people could vary their output, that we could vary the price and have it match up in the same sort of way that you do with a private good. So, any questions on Lindahl? Okay, true, false. Again, a government regulation that prohibits the discharge of a certain amount of pollutant and applies this equally to all producers will likely result in some firms producing less pollution that is optimal. Okay? So what's the optimal amount? Well, there's a marginal benefit to being able to pollute, right? I don't have to put the smokestack on or whatever. Okay? And we were talking, if the train is going along and throwing sparks, I don't have to put the spark arrestor on. But I got to match that up with the marginal cost. And so I may have a larger marginal benefit to polluting than you do, or I may impose a much lower marginal cost than you do. I've got some, again, I'm drying my corn, and you have some sort of noise ordinance that says you can't emit more than so many decibels of noise, okay? Well, if there's nobody around me, I've got a much lower marginal cost to everybody else than if I'm drying my corn in the middle of a subdivision. So if I make everybody the same threshold and say you can't go beyond that, then what's going to happen is some people are going to produce less emissions or less externality than is optimal. But generally that's how we do it, right? I mean, if you look at how regulations work, generally that's how they work, right? There's some sort of limit and then you can't go beyond that threshold. And the point is that that's not an efficient way to do that. Number two, a number of people got that wrong. A tax is proportional if the marginal tax rate does not change. No, it's if the average tax rate doesn't change. Remember, I drew the little diagram and I showed you the, use my new, really got a drag on it. Right, like we said, what if you had an income tax that looked like that, right? And so we have tax, and we have income, and we noted that the average tax rate was the slope. And so even though I had a marginal tax rate that didn't change, the average rate would be changing, you were getting higher, and so that would be a progressive tax, even though you had a constant marginal rate. So the correct answer there is a tax is proportional if the average tax rate doesn't change as your income rises. Number three, a tax that results in a similar tax burden for people in similar circumstances is said to satisfy vertical equity. No, that's horizontal equity. Okay, so that's why that was false. And then the last two are true. Vixel suggested that taxpayers presented with the amount of the good to be produced and the tax burden, and then vote on this until there's unanimity or near unanimity. Remember, we said that he realized that there was going to be high transactions costs of doing that. But Vixel was trying to, again, sort of make it so that there's unanimous decision. And the idea is that there's unanimity in the private sector. You buy a good until the marginal benefit to you is equal to the price. So everybody is happy with the amount of the good that they buy. No one forces you to buy stuff. And so he was trying to think of a way that how could you duplicate that in the public goods sector? And then the idea is that, okay, how are we gonna, we'll try it and say, okay, here's your tax burden. We're gonna have a sales tax. You can figure out what your tax is, and here's how much we're going to spend on this public good, okay? And so we would keep doing that over and over again until everybody says, okay, we're happy with that. Again, unless you had a really small group or you had a group where everybody sort of knew each other, that's probably not going to work. But the point is to give you an idea of maybe you want to have earmarked taxes, right? Maybe you want to have a gasoline tax where the tax revenue goes to the highways. And so we know that I'm going to pay about this much in gasoline tax, and I use the highways this much, and maybe a large percentage are happy with that. And then lastly, one of the criteria Adam Smith suggested in judging a tax is tax compliance, right? And remember, that was part of the administrative costs, right? He was talking about, and we made a little discussion about, maybe the flat tax was a reasonable idea because the compliance cost is much lower under a flat tax than, again, something where you have all these deductions and all these credits and everything else. So that was, again, part of the administrative cost that Smith was talking about. So, any questions on the true false? All right. Number one, define a Pareto optimal state and what are 3 conditions necessary for Pareto optimal state to exist, and then briefly explain how a competitive market results in each of these conditions being met. Well, when there was confusion, it was generally over people confusing what the condition was with what causes it to happen. Remember that we looked at the Edgeworth box diagram in order to ensure that you understood what the condition was, and then we talked a little bit about how competitive markets get you there. Again, you might want to, if you have trouble with that, lecture 4 in the recorded videos has that. That's where we had that discussion. So, and also if you look at the appendix to chapter 2. But Pareto optimal state, what was that? I can't make someone better off without making someone else worse off, right? It doesn't make sense to be at a non-Pareto optimal state because I could always make one of us better off. Now, again, there's lots of Pareto optimal states. And in ECON 415 and public choice, we talk about, can you pick among Pareto optimal states? Is there some sort of social welfare function that can get you there? And we talk about arrows and possibility theorem that basically says there really can't exist a social welfare function that satisfies certain reasonable conditions. But the point is that you'd rather be in a Pareto optimal state than a non-Pareto optimal state if all you're trying to do is maximize the utility for the community as a whole. So, what's the first condition? The condition is the margin utility x to the margin utility y must be the same for all, right? Because if that weren't the case, if you had a really high margin utility of x to y, and I had a very low margin utility of x to y, then we ought to swap x and y, right? When we drew the Edgeworth box diagram, remember that we had, this was the origin for person B and the origin for person A, and we noted that where those indifference curves were tangent to one another, I can't go this way if we have y and x. I can't make A better off without making B worse off if those things are tangent to one another. So the condition is the margin rates of substitution have to be equal for everybody. Now, why does that happen? In a competitive market, we assume that your utility maximizer, right? Utility maximization, what does that require? That requires the margin utility of x to the margin utility of y is equal to the price of x to the price of y, and then we assume that everybody faces the same price ratio. You don't face a different price ratio than I do. Now, why do we go through this whole thing? Because when the government intervenes and stuff, then what can happen? We can make it so you have a different price ratio than I do. Suppose that what happens if you get a voucher from the government to go buy rental housing, okay? If you get a voucher for a rental housing, then what will happen? You'll have a different price than I do. And so, that will goof this thing up, right? And so the why go through these 3 conditions is to show that when, there could be circumstances where you have a different marginal cost than I do, or basically, it's usually in the price ratio problem, that you have a different price than I do for some government reason, or there may be something, and we'll talk about it here in a second, for the second condition, that I'll have a different price as a buyer, or in the third condition, I'll have a different price as a buyer than you do as the seller, and so that'll goof it up too. So anyway, this is to give you why does the competitive market, when you take Econ 202, what do you learn? Everybody's a price taker, everybody maximizes their utility, and so what are the conditions? You learn the conditions. The margin utility per dollar has got to be the same between X and Y, so that shows up that way. Okay, so again, everybody has the same price ratio. Now, what's the second condition then is that you got to have efficiency in production, right? And that's got to be the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital has to be the same. But this is maybe in the production of X and Y, right? The same for all producers. So, very similar point, right? Instead of when we did the Edwards box diagram, what did we do? Instead of looking at utility curves, what did we do? We looked at isoquants, and we looked at how much you could produce of X and Y, and we noted that if you generated the production possibilities curve, what's going to happen? Those isoquants have to be tangent to one another. And if we looked at the capital and labor and the production of X and Y, instead of utilities, we put Y and X. You can't make more X without making less Y if those isoquants are tangent to one another, right? And again, it makes logical sense if what happens is the marginal product of labor to capital is really high and make an X relative to make a Y, then what do we ought to do? We ought to move some capital and labor around, right? So that, and then we could increase the amount of stuff in the world. So when you drew the production possibilities curve in Econ 202, you were assuming that this condition was holding. Now, what makes that condition hold? Cost minimization, right? That's what makes the condition hold. Cost minimization, and what is that? What does cost minimization require? It requires the marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital equal the price of labor to the price of capital. For that to happen, and then what again? We assume everybody faces the same price ratio. And so, if we all face the same price ratio, then I'm setting my marginal product of labor to marginal product of capital equal to the same thing that you are, and that set of conditions is going to hold. Now, if I had some government action, or there were some other outside force that was making it so that I had a different price of labor than you did, or I had a different price of capital than you did, that is, the tax code is, if you're when we look at the corporate income tax, maybe something will happen if you're a corporation, it'll be different than if you're not a corporation, right? And so what would happen is if you had the law having to do with deductibility of capital or something like that, then what would happen is they'd face different price ratios, and then this condition wouldn't hold. Again, it gives you an idea of, okay, what are we moving away from efficiency, or what might we do to make it so that we get towards efficiency? And then the last condition is what? It's that the overall benefits are that the marginal rate of transformation has to equal the ratio of the margin utilities. So what was the marginal rate of transformation? It's how much I can count when I move along that production possibilities curve between Y and X, as I'm moving this way. That's the marginal rate of transformation. And what is that? The marginal cost of X to the marginal cost of Y has to be equal to the margin utility of X to the margin utility of Y, right? So we called that the margin rate of transformation, and this is the margin rate of substitution. those things have to be equal to one another. And if you recall, what we did is we said, if you pick a point on the production possibilities curve, what did I do? Then I drew the Edgeworth box diagram there, and I said, okay, that slope has got to be equal to the common slopes of the indifference curves, and so if that is the condition that's necessary for Pareto optimality. Again, you can sort of think through what would happen if you had a really high marginal utility of X relative to Y, and you had a really low marginal cost of X relative to Y. Then you ought to be switching X and Y. Okay, just using your intuition. So, what is the condition that makes that happen? Right. So that's what has to what is necessary. That's the necessary condition. So this necessary condition, what makes that happen? What makes that happen is that, what do we assume? We assume that firms are profit maximizers, right? So if you're a profit maximizer, then what happens? Then the marginal cost of X equals the price of X, the marginal cost of Y equals the price of Y. And so the ratio of those marginal costs says the marginal cost of X to the marginal cost of Y has got to be equal to the price of X to the price of Y. But what we assumed was that if you're a utility maximizer, you're setting your marginal utility of X to the marginal utility of Y equal to that. So if you all have the same price ratio, then that condition will hold. Okay? So what do we in each case we said, okay, here's the condition, and we explain here's why it would happen, right? Why that's necessary to get to Pareto optimality. Otherwise, I could move things around. Then we say, okay, what assumption do we make? We assume that people maximize utility, they minimize costs, and they maximize profit. In each case, if you maximize utility, that tells you that you got to have the marginal rate of substitution equal to price ratio. If you're cost minimizing, you got to set your ratio of your marginal products equal to the price of labor to the price of capital. And if you're profit maximizing, you're setting your marginal cost equal to the price. And then, in each case, if everybody's facing the same price ratio, then you must end up with that condition holding. Okay, so again, in Econ 202, when you learn that, this is in 415 what we call the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. The first fundamental theorem of welfare economics is that perfectly competitive markets result in a Pareto optimal outcome, and that's what we just showed. So any questions now on that one? Okay, so make clear that you know what is the necessary condition, then what assumption do you make, and how does that assumption result in the condition holding? And a key to all of this is everybody's a price taker, right? Now, again, if I do something, let's say I impose a sales tax. What's the problem? The problem is and let's say the producers pay the sales tax. If I'm the producer paying the sales tax, the problem is the marginal, the price I'm receiving for X is different than the one you're paying, okay? So what does that mean? This third condition isn't going to hold. So it tells you that if you have a sales tax, or you have an excise tax, or if we were to look at labor-leisure trade-off, then what's going to happen is our price ratios are going to be different, and so that these conditions aren't going to hold. Any questions on that one? All right. Okay. All right. Number 2 was what's an externality? Okay. And an externality is where there's either a benefit from your action or a cost from your action that's not picked up in the price system. That is, you are not including it in your decision to do something. So if it's and then I asked you to give me a positive and negative externality. So a positive externality is wearing masks, right? you are, if the transmission of the virus is reduced by a little bit because of you're wearing a mask, when you decide to wear a mask, you're not considering the effect on other people, right? So we use the flu shot, same thing. When you're deciding whether to get the flu shot or you're deciding whether to get the vaccine, right? You're concerned about what's the benefit to you, not considering what's the added benefit to somebody else. So there's a positive externality. What will happen? We'll tend to not have as much of goods that have positive externalities. A negative externality, you're imposing a cost on somebody. And we use the example of usually in a production situation, we use the example of making electricity, or the standard example is often there's a train that's going along and causing sparks to set fires in the farmer's field, or you're a rancher and somebody's a farmer and your cows are going over and getting in the other person's crop. So when you're deciding, how, whether, and blight, actually, one of the students a number of years ago actually won an award from American Enterprise Institute on doing a paper on blight urban blight as an externality issue, right? You start letting your property run down, you don't consider the cost to everybody else in terms of their reduction in property values to them. So you're not going to get the efficient amount of upkeep of buildings. So it said use demand and supply curves to explain why there is a welfare loss from the negative externality that you use in your example. So I wanted you to use the negative externality, right? So I got dollars up here in Q. So the idea then is the demand curve is what? The marginal social benefit. We're assuming that everybody's demand curve is a marginal benefit curve. We go back to ECON 202. That the market demand curve is the sum of the individual demand curves. And similarly, the supply curve, that is equal to the marginal private cost, right? Because you're only considering the cost to you. So if there's a marginal externality, what's going to happen is if I add that, S prime is equal to the marginal private cost plus the marginal external cost. Then what, so the optimal amount is where the marginal social cost, which will include those two things, call that marginal social cost. Where is the marginal social cost equal to the marginal social benefit? It's here, right? So that would be Q star. This is QE, that's where we're going to go to, so we'll have that price, and we ought to really have a higher price. Now, what is the welfare loss, right? The welfare loss is that all the output from Q star to QE, what's the deal? That the marginal social cost is bigger than the marginal social benefit, right? So all those units have a marginal social cost up here, and there's a marginal social benefit there. So what is your welfare loss? Your welfare loss is that triangle. There were a number of you that wanted to make that the triangle. But if you made that the triangle, that's not making sense, right? What is the story that this picture is supposed to make up, right? The story is that for all the units between here and here, I got a marginal social cost above the marginal social benefit. So Rod Stewart's Every Picture Tells a Story ought to be that all this ought to be the triangle, right? All those marginal social costs are above the marginal social benefit. So that would be the welfare loss. Okay. And then what was a Pigouvian tax? The Pigouvian tax says I'm going to tax people equal to their marginal external cost. Right? If I knew what that was, AC Pigou, what he said, it says you're going to tax equal to the marginal external cost. If I did that, if I knew what the marginal external cost was, then what would happen is my private marginal cost would include the tax here, right? There'd be a tax right there. If I knew what that marginal external cost was, then I would put a Pigouvian tax there, and we'd end up with an optimal amount. Now, obviously, how do you implement that? Well, we've talked several times. It's very difficult to implement, but it gives you a general idea. Carbon tax. There's put some articles in your folder about carbon taxes. What is a carbon tax? A carbon tax says, okay, I'm going to tax you on the amount of carbon that you're sticking out there, okay? Because there's some marginal external cost to the amount of carbon that you're sticking out there. Well, what's the problem? Well, how do I know what the marginal external cost is? And again, it might be different for people that are in Wyoming than for people that are in New York City, okay? So, but it at least gives you an idea. It doesn't, it's not a bad idea. It's to say we're going to have some sort of tax on if we can figure out what that marginal external cost is, we'll put a tax on that. Again, how you figure that out, hard to do, but it gives you an idea of, hey, maybe this is some way that we could deal with this externality. All right. Any questions on number 2? Right. Okay. Number 3. What are 3 characteristics of the characteristics of a pure public good? Well, the first is it's non-rivaling consumption. Right? And what does that mean? It means that my consumption of it doesn't affect your consumption of it. The second is that we all get the same amount. And it's difficult to exclude. Okay? So that's a pure public good. So now the question then is, what's the Samuelson condition? The Samuelson condition is that the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost. And that was the idea that because we all get, my consumption of it doesn't affect your consumption of it, that we should add the demand curves up vertically rather than horizontally. Okay? So then it says, briefly explain Bowen's model to determine how much of a pure public good would result. Well, what was Bowen's model? Bowen says equal cost shares, right? MC over N. And it assumed that we have a normal distribution of preferences. And why is it that the median voter determines the outcome? Okay? The median voter determines the outcome because if I take, and it doesn't matter that we make it horizontal, we can make it downward sloping and get the same result, but easier to do this way. So I wanted you to show me, as I said before, why does the median voter determine the outcome? Because if we're looking at what's the optimum point for the median voter, the idea was that you would keep voting to see, will I expand from 0? And as I'm moving this way, as I move from 0 to Q3, what's going to happen is that people will keep voting for it, right? Because as I move this way, we start from 0, their marginal benefit is bigger than their marginal cost, okay? But if we go to this point in here, then I still have 4 people voting for it and 2 against it. When I get to here, if I try to go farther, then what will happen is that I'll have a majority voting against it because for 3, 4, and 5, their marginal benefit is less than their marginal cost. So I wanted you to explain that for output to the left of Q3, a majority would vote against it because these three here all have a marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost. If I try to go beyond that, then these people will vote against it because D3, D2, and D1 would all vote against going farther that way. And so that's the optimal amount, that's the amount that will be determined through the median voter. So that explains why the median voter determines the outcome. And then why is that equal to the Samuelson condition? The idea was that the median equals the mean. And the median voters demand curve there, it says if it's equal to the mean, then that says it's going to be equal to the sum of D over N, and that's equal to MC over N. But what is that? That's the sum of the marginal benefits equals the marginal cost. We multiply both sides by hand. So any questions on that one? Yeah.
I'm just curious, but does Jones' model break down if there's an even number of voters?
If what?
If there's an even number of voters?
If there's an even number of voters, then yeah, then you got a problem, right? Because it could go either way. But if there's an even number of voters, then what's the median, right? You don't really have a median. The idea of the median is like half are on the left and half are on the right, right? So if half are on the left and half are on the right, that's why you get that solution. All right, and then the last one was just pretty straightforward. It was just a matter of what, again, if you take a look at the textbook from page 371 in the textbook, it talks about alternatives to taxation. And we talked about debt finance, and we said if you debt finance, it might mask just as a problem that might have, it might mask what the true price of government is for people, so they vote for too much. But if you have a piece of capital like a highway or a bridge or something that the benefit's going to go out over time, maybe it makes sense to have the expenditures go out over time. Then we talked about inflation. You just have, I don't know if anybody's following the modern monetary theory that's out there. If you're taking intermediate macro, I don't know if they've talked about that or not. But anyway, the idea is that you can just print the money, right? Well, if you just print the money, if you go back to ECON 203, what's going to happen? If the amount of money is going up faster than the Q, the quantity, then you're going to have price inflation, right? And that's when we showed told the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Okay? And then we talked about user charges. I have to be able to exclude people if I'm going to have a user charge. And then we talked about, and that fit the benefit principle. And then we talked about government-owned enterprises. So where we talked about the Postal Service. And I gave you the information that they lost, what was it, $9 billion last year was the amount that they lost. And so, and the prices of the user charge and the price of the government-owned enterprise are going to be set with the political, through the political system as well. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. Again, if you long term, out of the 200 points, I said that 90% and above is an A minus to an A, 80% to 90% is between B minus and B plus, and then C minus is 60%. If you got less than 60%, which then you got a problem. So you should probably come in and bring your test in, and we'll talk about that. But there wasn't a lot of people that way. So you still have 150 points left, but it gives you at least an idea where you are. All right? Okay, so for next time, what we'll be doing is we're moving forward on the efficiency.